الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الكريم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Jazakallah khair for joining today, inshallah ta'ala. Just checking if Sheikh Abid can hear us.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. First and foremost, Jazakumullah khair to the brothers from UKIM for inviting me to come and share some thoughts today on the inner dimensions of fasting, and to look at I suppose what it is we're trying to achieve through this act of fasting. Before I do that, and before I get into the topic at hand, I want to just share one hadith in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or in which the Prophet ﷺ, emphasizes the importance of the blessed month of Ramadan. And we hear many times that this is a blessed month. But what makes this month so special? Of course, it's a month in which we try to perform one of the pillars of Islam. And it's a month that contains many different blessings, as we'll look at later on today, some of the hadith that talk about the virtues of fasting and some of the rewards of fasting. And we will see why it's a special deed. And it's something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is between the slave and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But one hadith I always like to start any conversations regarding Ramadan off with is the hadith of Talha ibn Ubaidillah. And this is the hadith in which Talha ibn Ubaidillah, he explains that there were two individuals who came and accepted Islam at the same time. So they came to the Prophet ﷺ and they accepted Islam at the same time. And these were two brothers. And one of them would partake in jihad more so than the other. So one of them would constantly be struggling in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the other one would not struggle as much. Now the one who was struggling in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he died as a shaheed. He died in one of the battles, and he was martyred. The other one, he lived 1 year longer. So he stayed for one more year. He lived one more year, and then he died a normal death. He died a normal death. Now Talha, he says that, one day I saw in a dream that I was at the door of paradise. And lo and behold, I was with these two men. These two men basically came out of, were sitting with me. And then he says, someone came out of paradise and allowed the man who passed away later, so who passed away 1 year later, he died the normal death. So somebody came out of paradise and took him into paradise first. Yes, took him into paradise first. And then he came out and he allowed the second one, the one who died as a martyr. He died 1 year earlier, but he died as a martyr. He then he came out and he took him into paradise second. And then he returned and said to me, the go back for your time has not come. Talha says, when I woke up, I was so surprised by this. I couldn't really understand what was going on. So he says, I discussed it with the companions, and then word reached the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that, why are you so surprised? What makes you so surprised about this dream? And the companions, they replied that, look, the one who, out of two of them, the one who died as a martyr, he was taken into paradise second, and he wasn't taken into paradise first. We would expect him to be taken into paradise first. And the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, Alisa qad makatha hadha ba'dahu sana. He said, did this one who was taken into paradise first, who actually died a normal death 1 year later, did he not live 1 year after? And he said, of course. And then the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he said, adraka Ramadan. فصام وصلى كذا وكذا من سجدة في السنة. He said that he lived to see another Ramadan. He basically worshipped Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in another Ramadan. He fasted. He prayed such and such salawat and performed such and such sajdas. And then the Prophet ﷺ, he said the difference between them is greater than the difference between the heavens and the earth. So this hadith, subhanallah, really shows us the fadl, the virtue of the blessed month of Ramadan. That this month that is fast approaching, this month that is literally around the corner for us, is a month of blessing. It's a month in which I'm sure Sheikh Fahim discussed in the last webinar last week some of the virtues of it. And I'm not going to go over them again because, as I said, Sheikh Fahim's covered them. But I just wanted to share this one hadith because really every time I think about this hadith, it really it opens my eyes to the virtue of what's about to come. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He allows us to reach the month of Ramadan, this blessed month in which we fulfill one of these pillars of Islam and we try to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the best that we can. Now, when it comes to fasting, we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He talks about fasting in Surah Al-Baqarah, the only place in the Quran in which Ramadan is actually mentioned. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the famous ayah, He says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الصِّيَامُ كَمَا كُتِبَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says that fasting is prescribed upon you as it was prescribed upon those before you, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, in order that you may attain taqwa. Yes, taqwa. So in this verse, we learn a number of things. We learn that fasting is number one, an obligation. Yes, fasting the month of Ramadan is an obligation. We also learn that that previous nations were also commanded to fast. Yes, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in this ayah, that previous nations were also commanded to fast. Now the scholars differ in terms of what was their fasting. Ibn Kathir and others, they mention that previous nations would fast 3 days a month, and there's a lot of discussion about this. But we learned that they would also fast. So this is an action similar to the prayer, similar to zakat that existed in previous nations. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala informs us of the true objective of this month, of this fasting. And it is not what? To lose weight. It is not to just do what everybody else in the community is doing. No, rather the objective of fasting is very clear, and that is that we become people of taqwa. That we become people. Now, what is taqwa? And we often hear it translated as fear, or awareness, and different terms are given. Taqwa is a very comprehensive term in the Sharia, and it's probably best defined as consciousness. Yes, although it has meanings of fear and awareness and etc., but it's really to become conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He informs us that actually fasting is an obligation upon you, as it was an obligation upon those before you, in order that you may become people who are conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the whole objective behind fasting is that we become people of taqwa. We become people of taqwa. And when you look at the different aspects of taqwa, of being conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when you look at the famous definition that was given by the companion when he was speaking to Umar, and he asked him that, have you ever walked through a thorny path? And he replied, yes. He said, what did you do? He said, I rolled up my clothes, my thobe, so I wouldn't be afflicted by the thorns. And then the response was what? That this is taqwa. That this is the definition of taqwa, that you are trying to protect yourself from anything that harms you. Yes, and there's nothing that harms us more than, of course, displeasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when we say we want to be people of taqwa, we are talking about becoming people who are conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and conscious of the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That we don't want to become people who disobey Allah. We stay away from those things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forbidden. We try to do those things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would like us to do or has commanded us to do. Ali radiallahu anh, he has another definition of taqwa. He says it's al-khawfu min al-jalil wal-amalu bit-tanzil wal-rida bil-qalil واستعداد ليوم الرحيل. He said, he gives a beautiful comprehensive definition of taqwa. He said taqwa is in essence to fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Let's fear the disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he says it's to act in accordance with the Quran. Yes, an aspect of taqwa is that you live your life in accordance with the Quran, with the injunctions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed in the Quran. You try to make the Quran your compass. You try to make the Quran that by which you live when it comes to your daily dealings, when it comes to your moral code and conduct. You base it on the Quran. Yes, this is what the Quran is. Unfortunately, today we've taken the Quran as what? As one of our teachers, he said that the Quran, subhanAllah, is the only book on earth which is read without understanding. He said, no other book on earth is read without understanding. Yes, and that's what we've reduced the Quran to. That we actually read this Quran without any understanding. And then, you would never pick up a book in French and just read it, if you don't understand it. The purpose behind reading a book is that you understand and gain some knowledge and information from that book. In the same way, we should have that attitude with the Quran. That when we read this Quran, the purpose is what? Is that we connect with the message. And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, Alif Lam Mim, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. That the Quran is, of course, a book of guidance. Yes, شهر رمضان الذي أنزل فيه القرآن هدى للناس. That the month of Ramadan is the month in which the Quran was revealed. Why was it revealed? هدى للناس, as a guidance for mankind. So we need to become people who transcend that what they call it sathi, that superficial relationship with the Quran, where it just becomes something that we just read and get into a habit of reading. Rather, we make the Quran something through which we try to live by. Yes, we try to live by this this Quran. So he says, he says that it's to وَالْعَمَلُ بِالتَّنْزِيلِ, that your actions are based upon the Quran. You try to implement the Quran in your life. That's an aspect of taqwa. That's what we're trying to achieve through fasting the month of Ramadan, is that we become people who fear Allah and fear disobeying Allah, that we try to act in accordance with the Quran. And then he says, وَالرِّضَى بِالْقَلِيلِ, that you are content with little. And subhanAllah, it's a beautiful aspect of taqwa that's not really discussed much, is to be content with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you. We live in a time where everybody is, in a rat race. Everybody's trying to climb the ladder. Everybody's looking for material gain. And gratitude is something that is diminished. If you find, if we're honest now, we are not really people who are grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We are always wanting more, wanting more, wanting more. And Ali radiallahu anhu is saying that actually taqwa, part of taqwa is that you are not constantly seeking more, that actually you are content with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you. And that's not to say that, of course, in life you don't strive to achieve. Yes, we should strive to achieve. There were many companions who achieved great things, who were businessmen, who were, by today's standard, millionaires. When you look at the likes of Abdurrahman ibn Auf, etc., Uthman radiallahu an, these were people who achieved great things. But that wasn't the pursuit of wealth wasn't the objective of their life. They used that wealth for the benefit of the Muslims. They used that wealth for for the Prophet ﷺ. When the Prophet ﷺ made a call, these people were ready with everything they had. So they didn't, they didn't, become engrossed by this dunya. And this is why you find the dua of the Prophet ﷺ, Allahumma la taj'al ad-dunya akbar hammina, that, oh Allah, do not allow this dunya to become our greatest concern. Yes, because when this dunya becomes your greatest concern, you forget about everything else. So anyway, coming back to the point, he says to be content with little. This is an aspect of taqwa, to be content with little. And this, as I said, it alludes to the concept of gratitude as well, that we should constantly be grateful. We should always be grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the countless blessings. When you, subhanAllah, think about the different blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has bestowed upon us, they would say that Sufyan ibn Uyayna and others, they would basically sit the night just recounting the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The blessings of health, the blessings of family, the blessings of wealth, the blessings of security, safety, eyesight. Even when you break all of these down, you should be grateful for eyesight. You should be grateful for the ability to listen. You should be, we're grateful for the aql that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has bestowed upon us. And it's so many blessings after blessings. We should, constantly be in a state of gratitude. And this is why, one of the scholars of the past, he said that where do most people fall down when it comes to gratitude is that they do not even recognize the blessing. Yeah, and this is why some of the scholars, they said that معرفة النعمة من أعظم أركان الشكر. They said that recognizing the blessing is pretty much the foundation of gratitude. If you don't recognize the blessing, then how can you be grateful? Yeah, you'll never be grateful. So the first step is actually to recognize the blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So all of these things that I've mentioned, the ability to to speak right now is a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes we fall under the illusion that everything we have in life is due to our hard work. Yeah, so we might be enjoying I have a nice house or a nice car and nice job and these things, and we think it's down to us, it's due to me. And we forget the role of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in all of this. That actually, if it wasn't for the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if it wasn't for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's tawfiq, I couldn't even get out of bed in the morning. And that's the truth, that's the reality. So the point being is that we should constantly be in a state of gratitude, and we should constantly think about the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Let's recount the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if we become people who are grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is where the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lies. Why? Because you're recognizing that Allah is al-Ghani, that He is the Mun'im, that He is the one who bestows blessings. Yes, and this is why He commands us in the Quran, فَاذْكُرُونِي أَذْكُرْكُمْ وَاشْكُرُوا لِي وَلَا تَكْفُرُونَ. Be grateful to me and be not ungrateful. Yes, be not ungrateful. Be grateful to me. وَإِن تَعُدُّوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ لَا تُحْصُوهَا. That if you try to recount or enumerate the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you'll never be able to. And one of the blessings is the fact that we can witness another Ramadan. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He allows us to reach Ramadan. But this is a great blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then Ali radiallahu anh, in his definition of taqwa, he finishes off and he says, وَالِاسْتِعْدَادُ لِيَوْمِ الرَّحِيلِ. A part of taqwa and this concept of taqwa is that we prepare for the day of judgment. We prepare for the day we depart this dunya. That's in essence what taqwa would be. Why? Because if you are somebody who is conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you're going to realize that this is the same Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that I'm going to return to. This is the same Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that I'm going to stand in front of on the day of judgment, and I will have to answer for my deeds. So you're saying a part of taqwa is what? Is that you prepare for that day. That you use the dunya to prepare for the akhirah. And that's what this dunya is. The dunya is simply a station that we pass through before we reach our ultimate destination. And this is why when the Prophet ﷺ, he described the dunya and what our relationship should be like with the dunya, he said, "Kun fi dunya ka'annaka gharib aw abiru sabil." That be in this worldly life as though you are a stranger or a traveler. And this is what your relationship should be like with this worldly life, that you are a traveler, you are simply passing by, you are simply passing through. And have that attitude of a traveler. It's the traveler, and if we say that somebody's traveling from Oldham or from Manchester to London and they stop off in Birmingham, they're not going to stop off in Birmingham and build a house. No, because they're passing through. Yeah, so they're not going to stop off. They might get some fuel, they might do what they need to do and then carry on that journey. In the same way, that's what our attitude should be like with life. That yes, we come, we live here and we work and whatnot, but we're simply passing through. Yeah, so we're doing what we need to do in order to achieve our ultimate and reach our ultimate destination. So Ali radiallahu anh is saying that a part of taqwa is what? Is that you prepare for that day of departure. Yeah, for that day of departure. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this concept of taqwa is mentioned many times in the Quran. This concept of becoming conscious of Allah, of becoming more aware of Allah, of living a life in obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in staying away from that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forbidden. This concept of taqwa is mentioned so many times in the Quran. And that's really, when we talk about what differentiates the people, yes, in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is taqwa. It is the level of taqwa that a person has. And in the farewell sermon, when the Prophet ﷺ gave his final address, as to over 100,000 companions in the days of Hajj, on the day of Arafah, in the valley of Arafah, and he addressed over 100,000 companions. And what did he say? He said that there's no a difference between an Arab and a non-Arab, a black and a white, that actually everybody is equal in front of Allah. But what differentiates the people is a level of taqwa, is a level of consciousness with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum," that the most honored of you in front of Allah, in the sight of Allah, are those who have the most taqwa, those who have the most taqwa. And it's this trait of taqwa which will be the means through which individuals enter into Jannah. That's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَسَارِعُوا إِلَى مَغْفِرَةٍ مِّن رَبِّكُمْ وَجَنَّةٍ عَرْضُهَا السَّمَاوَاتُ وَالْأَرْضُ أُعِدَّتْ لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that rush to the forgiveness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and a garden or a paradise, the width of which is like the heavens and the earth. It is prepared for who? It is prepared for the people of taqwa. It is prepared for the people who are conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because when you're conscious of Allah, then you will watch your deeds. When you're conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you will watch what you say. When you're conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you will watch where you look. When you're conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you will watch what you're listening to. And that's what Ramadan is about. And we all know, yes, we all know that to some degree, our level of consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increases in Ramadan. Yes, there's no doubt about it. And we become extra aware or extra conscious of what we're saying. We become extra conscious of what we're looking at. Yes, you will find that people will. I remember when I was in college many years ago, when the month of Ramadan would come, you would see brothers, they would say, "I'm not going to listen to music." You would see brothers who would say, "I'm not going to speak to these girls." And people would try. Why? Because they knew it was a special month and we have to be more conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So to some degree, we all become more conscious of Allah in the month of Ramadan. And that's what, of course, Ramadan is about, is that we change our state. We become people who, are more aware of our actions. Yes, more aware of what we are doing and what we are saying. And as I said, controlling our eyes, controlling our tongue, controlling our ears, performing more deeds, seeking to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's what the month of Ramadan is about. It's about seeing that change in an individual where they're coming closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where they're seeking the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What makes an individual come to the night prayer? Some brothers, they say to me that I don't pray in the masjid during the year, but in Ramadan I have to come. I have to come. I might be praying at home, praying at work, but I very rarely come to the masjid. But in the month of Ramadan, I have to come. Why? Because these brothers, they realize that, this is where the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lies. Now, of course, the challenge is that we don't just do it for this 1 month, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts us through this period in order for us to pick up these habits and become more conscious of Allah, for us to carry that on throughout the rest of the year. Yes, and that's why it's unfortunate that we find many of us, we will start some good deeds in Ramadan, whether that's the Quran, whether that's coming to the masjid. But as soon as Ramadan finishes, those deeds come to an end. And that's not the purpose of Ramadan. When the Salaf, they would say that a sign a person's Ramadan has been accepted is that they continue that which they started in Ramadan. They continue it out of Ramadan. And that's why there's that famous statement by one of the Salaf. He said that من كان يعبد رمضان فإن رمضان قد رحل ومن كان يعبد الله فإن الله حي فإن الله باق لا يرحل. That whoever worshipped Ramadan, then realize Ramadan has departed. But whoever worships the Lord of Ramadan, then realize that the Lord of Ramadan, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, will never leave and He is always present. So part of our taqwa is that we remain conscious of Allah throughout the year. We remain conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala throughout the year. And what's amazing about Ramadan is that, in Ramadan, we become so conscious of Allah that we will not eat or drink. Yes. And these are things that are normally permissible. It's normally permissible for a person to eat and drink. But in the month of Ramadan, we leave that which is normally halal. Yes, we leave that which is normally halal for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if we're leaving that which is normally halal, what about the haram? Yes, what about the haram? Yes, if we are now controlling ourselves to not consume that which is normally lawful for us to consume, then of course we need to be able to control ourselves from the haram. Yeah? So when we're developing the state of consciousness of Allah, and this is why I always say to people that, look, in Ramadan you could be in your bedroom by yourself and you can have something to eat, but you won't eat. Why won't you eat? Because you know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching. In the same way, you know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching when it comes to your eating and drinking, realize that Allah is watching when it comes to all these other sins as well. Allah is watching when you're speaking about another person. Allah is watching when you're looking at something you shouldn't be looking at. Allah is watching when the time of salah comes and you neglect the salah. Yes, Allah is always watching. He is Ar-Raqib. Yes, He is Ar-Raqib. But of course, the month of Ramadan, it gives us the opportunity to develop that consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to begin to build that relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Imam Ghazali rahimahullah, he mentioned something profound. He said in Ihya Ulumuddin, he said that he kind of divided fasting into three. And he said you have, those people who will fast, and it's like an ordinary fast. Yes, which means they will abstain from food and drink and sexual desires. Yes. And that's the very basic level when it comes to fasting, that a person just basically abstains from food, drink, and sexual desires. He says then you have the fasting, or the special level of fasting, and that is where a person keeps their ears, their eyes, their tongue, their hands, their feet, all of their organs free from sin. Yes, free from sin. So it's not just avoiding the food and drink, but actually you're avoiding sins completely. That's what you're trying to do. He says that's like the second level when it comes to fasting. That's the fasting, yani al-khas or khusus, yani the special level of fasting. And then he says you have like an extra special level. Yes, the creme de la creme. Those who are, who we should all aim to aspire to be when it comes to our fasts, falling in under this category. He says it's the fasting of the heart. Yes, from unworthy concerns and worldly thoughts. Yes, so you're in total disregard of anything else except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he said this type of fasting is not broken by consuming food or drink, but this type of fasting is broken by thinking of worldly matters. Yes, worldly matters, and taking your mind away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is like the high level when it comes to fasting. That's where a person now his complete thoughts of his Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But of course, it's very difficult to achieve for us living in this dunya with work and family and all of these things. But we should at least aim for the second level that Imam Ghazali talks about, and that is the fasting of the limbs. So the limbs don't fall into sin. Yes, the limbs don't fall into disobedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Prophet ﷺ, he said in the famous hadith that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not in need of you leaving your food and drink if you cannot leave your sins. Yeah, paraphrasing the hadith. For the one who does not leave evil speech and evil actions, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not in need of you leaving your food and drink. And that's why, because that's not the objective of fasting. The objective of fasting is not for you to just leave your food and drink, but it's actually for you to become a more conscious and better person. And so if you're going to just leave food and drink, but carry on with those same actions and the same sins that you were doing outside of Ramadan, then you've missed the objective of Ramadan. Yeah, you've missed the objective of Ramadan. So these are some of the points I wanted to mention with regards to the inner dimensions of fasting, the purpose of fasting, which is to become more conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the different levels of fasting, fasting, making our limbs also fast. So it's not just fasting from food and drink, but also fasting and abstaining, because that's what fasting is, it's abstaining. But abstaining not just from food and drink, abstaining from those other sins that we may commit and fall into. And one thing I suppose I'd just like to finish off on is for us to, I suppose, appreciate the opportunity that awaits, or the opportunity that inshallah we will have in a few weeks' time. For us to truly understand the great reward involved in fasting and fulfilling this pillar. one hadith which really just says it all is the hadith Qudsi, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that كل عمل ابن آدم له إلا الصيام فإنه لي وأنا أجزي به. He says that every action of the son of Adam that he does is for him. Yes, so every action, whether it's reading of the Quran, whether it's praying the Salah, all of these things are for him. He says, except for fasting. Yes, except for fasting, for it's for me and I will reward it. It's for me and I will reward it. We know that when a person does a good deed, they will get the reward of 10 to 700 for that deed. Yes, as we know from the hadith in Sahih Muslim, that any good deed you do, you will be rewarded 10 to 700 times for that one deed. Subhanallah, this is the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And how much reward you will get will depend on the level of sincerity and the quality of the action. The quality of the action. But fasting doesn't fall under that category of between 10 and 700. Why? Because of this hadith where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, it's for me and I will reward it. I.e., he left it without a limit. Yes, he left it without a limit. And Imam Ghazali rahimahullah, he says that there are two reasons why fasting has this special virtue over all other deeds. He says, because it's a secret and an internal action which no one can see except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes, except Allah. Nobody knows. As I said, when you have those moments by yourself, you can do whatever you want. But you won't. Why? Because you know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching. Yeah, so it's a deed that only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows. And he says, secondly, fasting actually overpowers the enemy of Allah, the shaitan. Yes, because the means of the shaitan is through desires. And by minimizing desires through abstaining from food and drink, the means of temptation are tightened. Yes. So it's that special action, special deed, and the reward. And other scholars, they said, why again is no limit given to this reward? Why? Because it requires patience. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that He will reward the patience بِغَيْرِ hisab, that there's no limit to the reward that those who are patient will be given. Those who are patient will be given. There's no limit to that reward. And fasting, of course, requires patience. Yes, it requires patience. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course, that He gives us patience to fast, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He grants us the ability to worship Him as He deserves to be worshipped, not only in Ramadan but outside of Ramadan. One or two more hadith I'd just like to finish off on. I know our time's coming to an end at 9 o'clock. But again, just these hadith which show us the importance and the virtue of fasting in the month of Ramadan. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said that fasting and the Quran intercede for the servant on the day of resurrection. Fasting will say, "O my Lord, I prevented him from food and desires, so accept my intercession for him." And the Quran will say, "I prevented him from sleep at night, so accept my intercession for him." So their intercession will be accepted. So this act of fasting will come on the day of judgment, and it will intercede, yes, for the one who used to fast, saying that this person gave up food and drink, gave up his desires for my sake, yes, for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so the fasting will come and intercede for him on the day of judgment. Of course, there are many other hadith. I'm just conscious of not going over the time. But the Prophet ﷺ, he said that the dua of the fasting person will never be refused. Yeah, will never be refused. And this is why we're always encouraged to increase our dua whilst in a state of fasting. And even when you look at, subhanAllah, and I'll end on this, when you look at the ayat of fasting in Surah Al-Baqarah, we find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from the verse that I mentioned earlier, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu kutiba alaykumus siyam ila akhir al-ayah, from here, for the next page and a half, there's all the discussion about fasting in Ramadan. And right in the middle of these verses, you find a verse. And that verse is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِذَا سَأَلَكَ عِبَادِي عَنِّي فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ أُجِيبُ دَعْوَةَ الدَّاعِ إِذَا دَعَانِ فَلْيَسْتَجِيبُوا لِي وَلْيُؤْمِنُوا بِي لَعَلَّهُمْ يَرْشُدُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that وَإِذَا سَأَلَكَ عِبَادِي عَنِّي, that when my slave asks you concerning me, and so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying to the Prophet ﷺ, that when my slave asks you concerning me, فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ, I am close. Now, what's so interesting about this ayah is that in Surah Al-Baqarah, we find that the Quraysh would ask the Prophet ﷺ many questions. يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْخَمْرِ يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْمَحِيدِ يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْخَمْرِ وَالْمَيْسِرِ. Yani, they ask you about such and such. They ask you about the menstrual cycle. They ask you about alcohol. They ask you about gambling. They ask you many questions were posed to the Prophet ﷺ. After each of these questions, يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنْ, you find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give the answer to the Prophet ﷺ. He will say, قُل, say, and then give the answer. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling the Prophet ﷺ, say to them, and then he gives the answer. When it comes to this ayah of dua, there is no say. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't tell the Prophet ﷺ, say to them, I am close. He just says directly, I am close. I am close. And this is, very unique when it comes to when the Prophet ﷺ was asked questions. And this is why the Mufassirin, the scholars of Tafsir, they said that in this is a sign. What is that sign? That when it comes to dua, there's nothing between the slave and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Just ask from Allah, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is waiting to respond. أُجِيبُ دَعْوَةَ الدَّاعِي إِذَا دَعَانِ. I respond to the call of the caller when he calls upon me. When he calls upon me. So call upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's, again, as I said, a unique aspect of fasting, is that du'as are more likely to be answered when you're in a state of fasting, due to all of these hadiths. Yes, at the time of iftar is another time in which du'as are accepted. We know from the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. So these are, again, many blessings, many benefits, many rewards awaiting us in the month of Ramadan. And as I said, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He allows us all to reach Ramadan. Of course, the Ummah and humanity as a whole is going through a great trial at this moment in time with this COVID-19, with the coronavirus. And many people are passing away. We've had in our own community people who have passed away from COVID-19, and I'm sure the communities that you're from, and you're listening from different areas, I'm sure you've also had Muslims who have passed away. So there's no guarantee, and that's the truth. There's no guarantee in life. We don't know when our time on this earth will come to an end, but we make the dua that many of the companions would make, Allahumma ballighna Ramadan, that, oh Allah, allow us to reach the month of Ramadan. And they would make this dua 6 months prior to Ramadan commencing or coming in. Why? Because they wanted to reach another Ramadan in which they could worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we also make that dua that, oh Allah, in these difficult times, allow us to reach another Ramadan. Oh Allah, allow us to worship you in Ramadan. Oh Allah, allow us and keep our families safe, keep all of our community safe during these difficult times. وجزاكم الله خير وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.
Jazakallah khair, Sheikh Abid. That was absolutely beautiful. Barakallah feekum. Do we have any questions? We have 2 or 3 minutes. We can take some questions if anybody has any. If not, inshallah ta'ala, we can move on. Let's have a look. No questions so far. No, Sheikh, there's no questions. Alhamdulillah. That's quite excellent. That means it was very comprehensive.
جزاكم الله خير. بارك الله فيك.
Jazakallah khair. Take care, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.